Numbers chapter 22. Then the Israelites travelled to the plains of Moab and camped along the Jordan across from Jericho. Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. The Moabites said to the elders of Midian, "This horde is going to lick up everything around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field." So Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Pethor, near the river, in his native land. Balak said, "A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people, because they're too powerful for me. Perhaps then I'll be able to defeat them and drive them out of the country. For I know that those you bless are blessed, and those you curse are cursed." The elders of Moab and Midian left, taking with them the fee for divination. When they came to Balaam, they told him what Balak had said. "Spend the night here," Balaam said to them, "and I will bring you back the answer the Lord gives me." So the Moabite princes stayed with him. God came to Balaam and asked, "Who are these men with you?" Balaam said to God, "Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, sent me this message. A people that has come out of Egypt covers the face of the land. Now come and put a curse on them for me. Perhaps then I'll be able to fight them and drive them away." But God said to Balaam, "Do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people, because they are blessed." The next morning Balaam got up and said to Balak's princes, "Go back to your own country, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you." So the Moabite princes returned to Balak and said, "Balaam refused to come with us." Then Balak sent other princes, more numerous and more distinguished than the first. They came to Balaam and said, "This is what Balak, son of Zippor, says. Do not let anything keep you from coming to me, because I will reward you handsomely and do whatever you say. Come and put a curse on these people for me." But Balaam answered them, "Even if Balak gave me his palace filled with silver and gold, I could not do anything, great or small, to go beyond the command of the Lord my God. Now stay here tonight, as the others did, and I will find out what else the Lord will tell me." That night God came to Balaam and said, "Since these men have come to summon you, go with them, but do only what I tell you." Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the princes of Moab. But God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand, she turned off the road into a field. Balaam beat her to get her back on the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between 2 vineyards with walls on both sides. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it, so he beat her again. Then the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn either to the right or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam, and he was angry and beat her with his staff. Then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam answered the donkey, "You've made a fool of me. If I had a sword in my hand, I'd kill you right now." The donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" "No," he said. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low and fell face down. The angel of the Lord asked him, "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If she had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared her." Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now if you are displeased, I will go back." The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, "Go with the men, but speak only what I tell you." So Balaam went with the princes of Balak. When Balak heard that Balaam was coming, he went out to meet him at the Moabite town on the Arnon border, at the edge of his territory. Balak said to Balaam, "Did I not send you an urgent summons? Why didn't you come to me? Am I really not able to reward you?" "Well, I have come to you now," Balaam replied. "But can I say just anything? I must speak only what God puts in my mouth." Then Balaam went with Balak to Kiriath Huzoth. Balak sacrificed cattle and sheep and gave some to Balaam and the princes who were with him. The next morning Balak took Balaam up to Bamoth Baal, and from there he saw part of the people.
Okay, well, as we continue our look at points in the Bible where walls are mentioned, it's interesting that this week we come to the other end of the Israelite journey. So last week we saw how the walls of water built up on either side so that the children of Israel, God's chosen people, could go through on dry ground, and Nathan led us through all of that account. We're now at the other end of their travels in the wilderness, so we come to the point where they've pretty much finished their 40-year journey, and we're going to look today at Israel's position, the point that they had got to, and then we're going to look at Balak's problem, the worry that he had about these people coming into his land, and then we're going to look at Balaam, and of course the link with our theme is that Balaam's foot was trapped against the wall at one point, but more about that in just a little while. Let's begin then by looking at Israel's position. So here in chapter 22 of Numbers, quite a long chapter, but I hope you got the gist of the story. Here are the Israelites, as I said, coming to the end of their journey. It's been a long journey. God has been teaching them much during this time. And they've come to a point where they are on the east side of the River Jordan. Now, to get into the Promised Land, they've got to cross over the River Jordan, and again, of course, there's a mighty miracle, but they've not got to that point yet. In the account here that was read for us earlier, they come to the plains of Moab, and God, of course, is with them. He's been gracious to them, he's been caring of them, and he speaks to them through Moses. Moses has been God's representative, the people's leader, and so if you can imagine a map, maybe you'll take a look at a map later on. You've got the River Jordan coming down from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. Well, the people of Israel now are sort of north end of the Dead Sea, east of the River Jordan, quite near to where Jericho is on the other side of the river. And by this point in their travels, if you look back into chapter 21, they've destroyed the king of Arad, one of the Canaanite kings. They've destroyed everything, the towns and the cities and so on. They've also dealt with two other kings, a king called Sihon and a king called Og. God gave the Israelites victory over those kings and their kingdoms. And so they're settled on the plains of Moab, but already they've blazed quite a trail. They've made their mark on this part of the land. And so Balak, the king of Moab, he's quite nervous, he's quite worried about what is happening. He's getting in a bit of a panic. And his problem is this. There are at least 2.5 million Israelites, and they're camping in his backyard. on the plains near to Moab. And he's saying, what shall I do? So there in verse 5, we heard earlier, he's saying a people has come out of Egypt. He knows a bit of the history. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people, he's saying this to Balaam, because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps then I will be able to defeat them and drive them out of the country. For I know that those you bless are blessed, and those you curse are cursed. So that was his message to Balaam, and it gives us an insight into how he's feeling. He's panicking, isn't he, that these people are going to take over the whole of his land. So he calls on Balaam. Now Balaam is a sorcerer, a magician, if you like. Not a magician like you might see on telly with all the illusions and so on, but here's a man who's in the grips of the devil. He's into this process called divination, where he will contact spirits, evil spirits, and get in touch with so-called dead relatives for people, and this kind of thing, and it's known throughout the land that if he curses somebody, then they are cursed, and if he blesses somebody, that they are blessed. He's involved in the spiritual world under the influence of Satan. Now, later on in Deuteronomy, the next book in the Bible, God makes it very clear to his people that divination is prohibited, that it's wrong, that it's awful in God's sight. And it's clear that it's a wrong thing, being in league with the devil. But Balak, the king here, is determined that Balaam is going to curse the Israelites. So he sends a group of people to fetch Balaam. He sends some money, the normal divination fee, and Balaam refuses. And so he sends a second party, a more distinguished group, a bigger group of kind of special envoys to try to tempt Balaam, and one of the very relevant points is that he sends more money this second time as well. So a distinguished group, more money and more persuasive power to try and get Balaam to come and put a curse on this people that are camping in Balak's backyard. So that's a little bit about Israel and a little bit about Balaam. Balak. But what about Balaam? When we read about Balaam through this account, and it may be that when you were listening to it earlier you thought, well, he's not a bad chap. A quick read through and he seems to be doing and saying the right thing. He converses with God. So just going back to the chapter in verse 8, we read that he says to this first group that come to him, "Spend the night here," Balaam said to them, "and I will bring you back the answer that the Lord gives me." So the Moabite princes stayed with him. God came to Balaam and asked, "Who are these men with you?" It seems that he's got a hotline to God. He's speaking with God, and God is replying to him. And so there in verse 13, we see that after a conversation with God during the night, the next morning Balaam got up and said to Balak's princes, "Go back to your own country, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you." And we could give Balaam a pat on the back and say, "Well done, Balaam, you've done the right thing." And then, in fact, in verse 18, when the second envoy, the second group, goes to Balaam, sent from Balak, Balaam answers them, "Even if Balak gave me his palace filled with silver and gold, I could not do anything great or small to go beyond the command of the Lord my God." That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It seems that he's listening to God, and he's putting on a big show of the fact that actually nothing can make me go if God has said that I shouldn't go. And then, if anything, as we continue to read through the account, it seems that actually God is being unfair here. Because once the second envoy has visited, Balaam agrees to go with them the following morning. And then we read that God is angry at his decision, even though God has said, Balaam, you can go with them, but only tell them what I say. So what's going on here? Well, God actually reveals the truth to us. We need to continue through the account to find the truth. And on this journey that Balaam takes, he gets on a donkey, he's got 2 servants with him, and he sets off with this group who have come to ask him to come to Balak. But on the journey, the angel of the Lord appears. And although Balaam doesn't see the angel of the Lord, the donkey does. And we read that God says to Balaam, "You have been stubbornly resisting me," or "your path is a reckless one." I had a look at this phrase in the different versions. So the NIV, as we read it, said your path is a reckless one. One of the other translations is that you're stubbornly resisting me. A couple of other translations say your way is perverse. In other words, Balaam might be saying the right things. He might be conversing with God. And it may be that he seems at first to be obeying God, but somehow he strayed from God's path. In fact, the angel of the Lord says to Balaam, "If it wasn't for the donkey, I would have killed you by now." And then in verse 34 of the chapter, Balaam seems to be remorseful for the path that he has taken. Verse 34, "I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now, if you are displeased, I will go back." He seems to be being a very good boy and doing all the right things. But from other scriptures, we can recognize that all of this is actually empty talk. So what's the problem here? Well, I think there are at least 3 problems with the way that Balaam is acting. And I think it's important that we look at these 3 problems and recognize what is happening so that we don't make the same mistake in our own lives. The first thing we've got to say really about Balaam when we look at the actual truth of this account is that Balaam had a foot in both camps. Balaam had a foot in both camps. Now, he also had a foot stuck against the wall, so it seems that he's in quite an uncomfortable position, doesn't it? But really, although Balaam was saying the right things and seems at times to actually be doing the right things, he's actually still hanging on to his old life, even though he is communicating with God. Actually, we see from other scriptures that really Balaam is saying, if I can get some money out of this, it's worthwhile going ahead with it. And we do recognize actually that Balaam was compliant with Balak's request. He is going along with Balak. In Deuteronomy 23 verse 5 we read this: "The Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you." Now, that is God speaking to his people through Moses, and he's saying that Balaam was actually trying to curse the people, but God turned the curse into a blessing. So we can see that Balaam very clearly has a foot in both camps. He's on the side of the devil, but he's kind of just making the right overtures about God. He's saying the right things, and it looks at first sight as if God is actually working through him. But as we go on and look into the account a bit more deeply, we recognise that although he knew God, or at least knew of God, he didn't see God. I used to preach at a little tiny chapel in Leicestershire, and there were only a few people gathered. Sometimes I would go and speak at the midweek meeting, and one week I was speaking about Elijah and the way he was taken up into heaven and didn't die. And one of the old fellas who'd been a farmer all his life, and sometimes in the warmth of the room on a Wednesday night, which was when we met, he would look as if he was falling asleep by the fireside. But after I'd finished speaking, he said, "Oh, we know a riddle about that one," and the riddle was this: two who lived and never died, two who spoke and never lied. Well, I started to try and work out the riddle. Of course, one who lived and never died was Elijah, and it didn't take me too long to recognize that, okay, Enoch was another who just walked on into the presence of God. So they were the two who lived and never died. But then two who spoke and never lied. Well, of course, one was Jesus. And it turns out I didn't get it, but I had to be told the other one was Balaam's donkey. Someone who spoke, an animal who spoke, but never lied. Well, that's a riddle you can try on somebody if you want to. I didn't quite get it, but you could try it on someone else and see if they're a bit more clever than I am. Anyway. The donkey does seem to be the wise one in this whole episode, doesn't he? The donkey saw God, or at least God's angel, God's representative there. And although Balaam had said all the right things and had even communicated with God, it seems that he didn't actually commune with God. He didn't know him as Lord and Sovereign. I've been reading a book just recently about a man called Peter Marshall, a Scotsman who actually went to America to train in the ministry and became quite a famous pastor out in the States. Ended up in Washington ministering to senators and even the president and judges and lawyers and so on. And there was one man who particularly enjoyed Peter Marshall's ministry and was writing about him, and said that as soon as you heard Peter speak when he began his sermon, you knew it was a man who had spent much time with God. I think a brief time with Balaam would reveal the fact that actually he hadn't spent much time with God. You see, through this donkey, God had given him at least 3 chances. First of all, in verse 23, we read that the angel of the Lord stood in the road with a drawn sword in his hand, and the donkey turned off the road into a field. In other words, God was saying through his angel, you're on the wrong road. The angel actually said, as we mentioned already, you're on a reckless path. Then secondly, we read in verses 24 and 25, then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between 2 vineyards with walls on both sides. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. So he beat her again. God seeks to speak to Balaam again. You're up against the wall. Won't you listen to me? But still he's blind to the fact that God is there in the form of his angel in front of him. And then, of course, in verses 26 and 7, we read how the donkey just gives up. The road's so narrow, there's nowhere to go. The angel of the Lord is in front of him, and the donkey just sits down. And it's as if God is saying to Balaam, you're left high and dry. You've got nowhere to go. You've got nothing to take you where you want to go. And God seems to be saying, I want nothing more to do with you. So what's the problem with Balaam? Well, he had a foot in both camps. Secondly, although he knew God, he didn't see God. And thirdly, it seems that he did continue in his old ways. Even after this incident, he continued in his divination, in his magician's work, and so on. You know, I'm always pleased when there's a difficult passage in the Old Testament, when the New Testament opens it up for us and gives us some of the helpful truths that we need to know. In the New Testament, there's a couple of writers that help us. First of all, Peter. In his second letter, chapter 2 and verse 15, he says this. He's speaking of the folly of false teachers in the church, and he says, they have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness. That's Peter speaking about Balaam. He loved the ways of wickedness. Now you could say, well, Peter wasn't around in Balaam's day. This is years afterwards. But you've got to remember that these gospel writers are writing under the influence of the Holy Spirit. And Peter is very clear in his letters that nothing's made up, that they actually saw Jesus, they knew Jesus, and that those that write about things are carried along by the Spirit to write what God wants us to read. So Peter says he was a man who loved the wages of wickedness. And he goes on to say, but he was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, a beast without speech, who spoke with a man's voice and restrained the prophet's madness. It took a donkey to make Balaam see the error of his ways. And yet it seems fairly clear that he didn't alter from the error of his ways. Jude, right at the end of the New Testament, says in verse 11 of that single chapter, talking again of godless people in the church, they have rushed for profit into Balaam's error. So despite all that Balaam says, despite what he seems to be doing right, he's only in it for the money. We read that not long after this incident, the Israelites clashed with the Midianites and many were killed, including Balaam. Numbers 31 and verse 8, we read a report of that very fact. And in Joshua 13:22, referring to exactly the same incident, it says, Balaam, son of Beor, who practiced divination, was killed. That was his legacy. He was the man who practiced divination. So what does all that mean for us? Well, it's very easy for us to make the three same mistakes as Balaam did. It's possible for us to have a foot in both camps, to say all the right things, but not to be right with God. It's also quite possible today to know of God, in fact to know a lot about him, and even at times to speak with him, but not to have that relationship with him, not to see him, to fail to see him as Balaam did. So it's possible to have a foot in both camps. It's possible to know of him and yet not really know him and see him. And it's possible that even having been pinned to the wall by God, coming face to face with him, to continue in our own ways, our old ways, to do our own thing rather than God's thing. Let's not be like those who go astray and went Balaam's way. Let's be those who recognise God for who he is and for what he has done for his people. Let's be like Joshua. We're going to see more of him when we see how the walls of Jericho tumbled and how God wrought a victory because of the faith there of God's people. Let's be like that. Let's know God for truly who he is. It might be that he's got your foot against the wall today, that he's trying to say something to you, that he's trying to hold you back from the error of your ways. Let's listen to God. Let's make sure we know that he is there. Let's speak to him and listen to what he has to say and not continue in our old ways, but go his way. You know, the Apostle Paul, when he writes to the church in Corinth, he says, now is the time of God's favour. Now is the day of salvation. Let's not put it off, but let's get right with God. Let's not continue in our old ways, but follow him and know him for who he really is.